Welcome back to part 2 of my societal values deep dive. It's almost the new year, so what better way to spend our time is then investigating these various complicated numbers and stats. Today we're going to try and get through mercantilism versus free trade, belligerent versus conciliatory, quality versus quantity, and offense versus defense. We'll leave the later ones for later. Starting off straight away with mercantilism versus free trade. These numbers come into the quite complicated trade mechanics, but to put it quite as bluntly as I possibly can, free trade increases your trade advantage, which makes it so trade advantage affect whether you gain access to goods first in a market. To put it as simply as possible, if there were two swords in a market and 3 countries wanted them, the 2 countries with the highest trade advantage in that market would get those swords, and the third one wouldn't get anything. So trade advantage is a very good stat when it comes to gaining access to goods in other markets, as well as in your own. Trade efficiency simply just increases the amount of money you make from selling goods, so that's nice. Trade protection's where it becomes a little negative. So the way locations work is, the world is of course divided up into markets, and what affects which market a location is based on the market protection of that location. So with low market protection or negative market protection like free trade has, it's possible for locations to slip out of the control of your market and into control of another nation that controls that location. Isn't really that big of a deal unless you're playing as maybe a smaller trade-focused nation who's forcing locations in other countries to be a part of your market and profiting off that. The rest of these modifiers are all for AI, except for this one, burgers trade capacity. So I've been looking into this a bit. So burgers trade kind of in the background, and I'm not sure it's a good thing, funnily enough, mainly because burgers will often sell the goods within your country to foreign markets, and you, of course, won't see the profit of that. It will go straight into the burgers' coffers, which I suppose they may pay a little tax on. For example, if we look at this location here, we've got our tax breakdown. As you can see, burgers are most of the tax share from here. Unfortunately, we can't see a breakdown of where exactly their money comes from, but a fair amount of that is coming from them trading goods. But as I said, there are situations where you don't really want the goods in your markets to be traded without your consent to other markets. Maybe you don't want all your cool cannons and guns to be sold to your rivals' markets. Maybe you don't want all your precious resources to be sold to other markets, unless it's you doing it, of course. So I'm still not 100%, but I do think the burger trade capacity can end up being a little bit of a bad thing. Onto mercantilism, the stats are really kind of just the opposite. You have less trade efficiency, but you have market protection, which ensures that locations are forced to stay in your market. You also have a decrease to trade maintenance, which decreases the cost of actually having your trades active. And then you have this export cost from markets for foreign merchants. This essentially forces foreign merchants to pay more to buy your goods, which is kind of a good thing because it makes a little more money for your market while punishing foreign countries' merchants. But let's talk a little bit about events now for these societal values. There are 11 events for free trade and 10 for mercantilism. Most of the events, as you can imagine, revolve around money. Mercantilism actually has quite a few events that increase inflation, which is bad, and it also only has 4 temporary modifiers. Here's an example of what I mean for mercantilism. We have this production of improvements one, which gives the production improvements modifier for 10 years, which just gives product efficiency plus 5. And then we have the opposite event, which gives production stifled, which gives you a choice between getting the production stifled, which reduces production efficiency by 4% for 10 years, or by getting 2.5 inflation. And then the next one for mercantilism is this one, successful bureaucracy, which increases tax efficiency by 5 for 10 years, or the opposite, corrupt bureaucracy, which decreases it by 5 for 10 years. Pretty simple. On the flip side, free trade has similar events, but for some reason they're not mutually exclusive. So for example, you could have business booming here, which gives 2.5 to your trade efficiency, but you could also have trade complacency, which gives minus 2.5 to your trade efficiency. I'm not really sure if this is intentional because they kind of mirror the mercantile events, which are mutually exclusive, But do keep in mind that for free trade, these aren't mutually exclusive, so you could just have both, which means they're counteracting each other. Luckily, the next two events for free trade are mutually exclusive. We have the Adventurous Merchants and Our Merchants Doing Poorly. Adventurous Merchants gives trade maintenance -10, plus increasing your trade range by 25%, whereas Merchants Doing Poorly increases your trade maintenance by 10. As I mentioned, these are mutually exclusive, unlike those last two, which probably should be. Free trade then has this next set of events which are mutually exclusive, which gives free trade is working, which increases your trade advantage by 10, or this far worse one, trade policy is failing, which decreases your trade advantage by 25, which is basically double the value you get for this event, which is pretty horrible, honestly. When it comes to reforms, it's pretty easy to talk about because free trade doesn't have a single unique reform available to it, while mercantilism has 3. For our 3 mercantile reforms, we have state-sponsored market, which increases trade efficiency by 5 and market protection by 10, while pushing you towards mercantilism. This reform is only available in the Age of Revolutions, though, so do keep that in mind. For our other 2, they are both available in the Age of Reformation. The first one, status of monopolies, increases product efficiency by 2.5 and trade protection by 10, while pushing you towards plutocracy, which is interesting. And then we have state-backed merchant fleet. This requires both mercantilism and navy to be at 50. It decreases the maintenance cost of your lightships by 20%, increases the trade advantage you get from your maritime presence in a sea zone, and reduces the trade capacity cost when trading over sea, that being when trade passes through sea zones. And then it pushes you towards the outward societal value, which we'll talk about a little later. To sum it up, I think I prefer mercantilism to free trade. When it comes to reforms, mercantilism is just flat out better. When it comes to the stats, free trade is better because it increases the trade advantage and the trade efficiency, I feel, whereas mercantilism decreases the amount of money you make from trade and doesn't give any bonus to trade advantage, only reduces the cost of trading. But on the other side, free trade's burger modifier means that the burgers are going to be trading more of your goods than maybe you want them to trade. And when it comes to events, the mercantile branch actually has quite a few events that just give you free money. It also has some events that cost you money, but you know, that's the way of the world. Personally, I don't think either of them gives really good modifiers to the point where I would want them one flat out over the other, so I'll leave that up to player's choice. I do quite like my favorite modifier between them is probably this Corporation of the Burger class, because it increases tax efficiency by 1, which essentially means to a 1% increase in your tax income. But then I'm not a trade expert. When it comes to reforms, as I mentioned, it's an easy win for mercantilism just because it has them. So with all that said, let's move on to belligerent versus conciliatory. When looking at these two, I think it really depends on your preferred style of playing. To start with, these antagonism gain from taking land modifiers, you can kind of ignore them because they're what your country feels. Your country will gain more antagonism when they take land or break truces or declare war without casus bellis. It doesn't affect how we're perceived for doing the same thing. The real numbers to look at are this war score cost decrease of 10 for belligerent, spy network construction for belligerent, this casus belli creation speed plus 33%, whereas on the flip side, conciliatory increases the efficiency of the cabinet by 10, but also increases the time it takes to create casus bellis by 33%, then gives an extra 4 diplomatic reputation, which is kind of pretty nice. So on the surface, belligerent makes conquering land easier by decreasing the cost of actually taking things, whereas conciliatory doesn't do that, but it does increase the efficiency of your cabinet and gives you an increase to your diplomatic reputation, which helps stave off coalitions and makes countries like you. When it comes to events, belligerent is all about spies, gaining events which make your spies better, having negative events that make your spies worse, getting casus belli creation speed increases, getting diplomatic capacity decreases, and this event I quite like here. Our spies discover a good bureaucrat, which can give you a choice between legitimacy, prestige, or army and naval tradition. If belligerent is all about spies, conciliatory is all about diplomats. They have a lot of good events. They have a lot of events revolving around diplomats. This brilliant diplomat, which increases your monthly diplomats by 0.1 and increases your diplomat capacity by 1. Successful embassy, which it gives you 10 prestige, increases your relationship by 30 with a random country. Babbling buffoon, which decreases your diplomatic reputation by 1, or the opposite, which increases your diplomatic reputation by 1. But also a few events about the government, like this government corruption, which reduces stability or gives inflation. This cabinet dynamicism, which increases your efficiency of the cabinet by 10. Or this incompetent diplomats, which gives you a choice between actually gaining estate satisfaction with the nobility in return for gaining incompetent diplomats for 10 years, or just losing relations with the nobility. When it comes to reforms, both societal values actually have one, with belligerent having 2. For our conciliatory one, we have this policy of calculated delay, which improves relationships, gives an improved relationships modifier of 15%. And a antagonism change modifier of 0.05, which I believe means that antagonism will decrease by 0.05 a year, I think. The improved relations is quite nice, but I'm not sure it's worth a reform slot nice. It also pushes you towards inward, which you may want to do depending if you decide to go all in on inward. But we'll talk about inwardness versus outwardness at a later date. For our 2 belligerent reforms, each of them requires belligerent to be high to go something else. This first one, recognition of local policies, requires absolutionism and belligerent to be at 50%. And then gives a speed of integration of 10. Speed of integration is how fast you can core locations, not to be confused with how fast you can integrate vassals. It also then gives a slight increase to communalism of 0.10. Honestly, there aren't that many sources of speed of integration into the game, so I think that might make this one very valuable if you're going a very conquest heavy. Moving on to our other option, we have mandatory service. This requires you to have quantity of 50% together with your belligerence of 50%. And it gives a 10% increase to both sailors, the amount of sailors produced and the amount of manpower produced, with a push towards communalism. Personally, I don't think this is that great. I'm not something I would probably spend a reform on just for a 10% increase to our sailors or manpower, because both of these things you can increase by building the buildings related to it. And considering you have to wait until the age of revolutions to get this reform, you probably have already passed that point. To go back to the other one, because I forgot to mention it, the recognition of local policies requires you to be in the age of absolutionism, which shouldn't be surprising considering it requires absolutionism. To finish up my thoughts on these 2, I think if you've reached a point in the game where coalitions are not really a problem, and it's you've more reached a point where you're kind of just conquering without much of a care, then I think belligerent is definitely the one to go for, just because it decreases the cost of actually taking land by 10%. And also makes your spies better, and spies are pretty great. And the reform that I mentioned lets you integrate land faster, is also pretty great. Conciliatory, if you're going vassal heavy, I think it would be pretty good for the increase to your diplomatic reputation, as well as if you're a little scared of coalitions, that would also be helpful. Of course, the efficiency of cabinet is great, but I think the one reform it has is pretty lacking. Not really a fan of just increasing diplomatic, getting a 15% increase to diplomatic relations. And the events, while they are okay, they don't really wow me. Neither of the country's events really wowed me, with the conciliatory just increasing or decreasing your diplomatic reputation or other diplomatic things, whereas belligerent increased your spy network speed and co-creation speed. Neither of the 2 sets of events really enamored me. But if I did have to choose, I think I would pick belligerent, just because it means conquering faster, and if you combine it with that reform, coring faster, which is definitely nice. Now let's move on to quantity versus quality. You probably don't need me to explain in much detail, but quality makes your army better. It increases the maintenance of paying for your army, of course, but it increases how fast they recover morale, increases military tactics, which supposedly just reduces the damage a regiment takes in combat, and then increases army initiative. If you've ever played as or played against a nation with a lot of cavalry, like the Golden Horde, you may have noticed that army initiative can lead to them actually just winning a battle almost immediately, because it affects how fast the units fight, as it were, or join the battle. So it's definitely something you want a lot of, so you don't, at the very least, don't get caught out by someone with high initiative joining the battle and fighting you before you are fighting them, which can lead to massive casualties. As I said, if you've played against the Golden Horde or played as them, you've probably seen how fast battles can go just because they're all cavalry armies, will often destroy the other army before they even get a chance to respond. Quantity, on the flip side, decreases the army maintenance and gives possible frontage of 10%. I honestly think this frontage bonus is probably worth it alone and makes quantity probably better, just because it means you'll be able to have more units on your front line than a quality country will. And surely more units is probably better than slightly better units. I'm not sure, I haven't fully done the math. This army initiative minus 25% though is actively horrible. As I've already mentioned, you really want your army initiative to be high and not low. This unit food consumption minus 10 is great though, just because it means you'll take longer for your armies to actually starve when they run out of food. When it comes to events, quantity has 8 and quality has 10, putting quality ahead when it comes to amount, but are they a good amount? When it comes to events, quality is pretty good, I think, but not amazing. It has, when it comes to temporary modifiers, we have these ones. Steady Boys, which gives good discipline, which just gives you 2.5 discipline for 10 years. Back to the Front, which just gives you a army morale recovery speed of 1 for 10 years. And then we actually have a few events that strengthen our ships. We have this Protected Commerce, which increases the power of light ships by 5 and decreases the trade maintenance by 5. Prime Example, which gives Iron Men, which increases your heavy ship's power by 5. Or They Will Fear Us, which gives the power of the fleet, which increases the Navy morale recovery by 1 for 10 years. They do have some of the events where they have to pay money or manpower or lose army tradition though. On the other side with quantity, as mentioned, they only have 8 events. When it comes to quantity, they only actually have 3 negative events. There's People After Army, which makes you lose 10 prestige. Leaders Are Harder to Find, which makes you lose 5 army tradition, and this Administrative Problems, which increases army maintenance by 10 for 10 years, which essentially just counteracts the positive effect of maxed quantity, being that 10 army maintenance. They actually have 2 events that give them more soldiers. Men Flop to the Colours, which gives them some more manpower, and More Men for the Army, which also gives them more manpower. But surprisingly enough, they don't have any temporary modifiers that increase the quality of their army or quantity. Instead, they have this horse population boom, which increases the output of horse production in their locations, as well as the surplus equipment, which increases weaponry output. So no actual bonuses for your army in temporary modifiers. There's also this negative modifier I forgot, which is timber shortage, which decreases the lumber output for 10 years. When it comes to reforms, quality has 1 and quantity has 2. We'll start with the quantity one because we already mentioned this mandatory service, so I won't dwell on it too long, but it requires 50 quantity. Then we have this military allotment. This becomes available in the Age of Absolutionism and gives you possible soldiers for each 1,000 population plus 100. So for every 1,000 pops in a location, you'll gain 100 potential soldiers. It does decrease the amount max tax for the peasantry by 5, but it increases reinforcement speed by 25% and increases monthly progress to free subjects of 0.10. The real question is, how much useful would it be having an extra 100 soldiers in every location for every 1,000 pop? Well, you need to think about what soldiers actually do. Soldiers, based on their literacy level, give manpower and fort defense in the locations they're in. They do count as peasants, even though they're, soldiers. So something to be aware of. Personally, I'm not sure whether it's really worth the extra 100 soldiers. I haven't really thought about it much because I've never actually seen this reform before. Well, I've probably seen it, but I haven't thought about it very hard. One of the main benefits would just be able to massively increase your manpower, because in a lot of locations, you don't have soldiers unless there's buildings that want you to make them like, that produce them like castles. So with this, you'll have soldiers essentially everywhere, even in locations that maybe there really wouldn't be any, which could lead you to a massive increase in manpower just from how many soldiers you have scattered around. I think you could also cut costs in a way, because it means you could demolish certain buildings that produce soldiers, like armories, since you wouldn't necessarily need them if you have so many soldiers being produced just for free, essentially. Because if you look at an armory, it employs 1,000 soldiers and gives you a monthly manpower of 10. Whereas if you just had a location with 10,000 civilians, you would automatically get 1,000 soldiers in it just from having that reform. And if you had a location with 40,000 soldiers or 50,000 like this city here, it means you'd get 5,000 soldiers in that location. As I said, I haven't fully thought about this reform. Maybe it's something I need to test to see if it is actually really good. Because I'm seeing potential here to cut costs in things like armories, but then armories are kind of good in a different... Well, I'll stop talking about this because I could easily just obsess over it. Instead, let's move on and look at that quality reform. Here's our one quality reform. It gives discipline of 5%, but it decreases weaponry output by 20%, I suppose, because it means they're ensuring they have the highest quality weapons, which means less weapons are produced because they have to adhere to higher standards, but we gain a discipline bonus because it means we have high quality weapons. It also pushes us towards capital economy. I mean, discipline is pretty great, so that alone might make this worth it. Honestly, it's pretty close between quality and quantity, I think. Quality really does just gives you lots of bonuses to make your army and your navies better through events, as well as these stats for your armies. And that one reform that they giving them an extra 5 discipline is definitely nice. But quantity, this frontage bonus is definitely great because it means more units will be able to get into the battle faster. And that reform I mentioned, which can lead to you having lots and lots of manpower by producing soldiers everywhere, could really let quantity just absolutely swarm the world with armies. If it can be used the way I'm thinking it can be used, by stacking literacy to make your soldiers very intelligent, which increases the amount of manpower they produce. So I'm going to leave this as I'm not sure. Quantity definitely leads to better armies, but quality just leads to more of them. Enough, we'll move on. Now let's look at offense versus defense. This should be pretty obvious. Offense makes your army faster, but it makes your forts a lot weaker at max level, minus 50% to your fort's defense. But it increases your siege ability and your assault ability. Whereas defensive decreases your army movement speed, but increases your fort defense by 50% and increases your combat speed. This affects how fast units move from the back rows or the reserves to the front or the sections in the battle. It also affects ships. We also get a bonus to how many forts we can create before we go over our limit, as well as a decrease to the cost of maintaining forts of 20%, which is pretty great. When it comes to events, offensive has quite a few negative ones that reduce your prestige, your stability, as well as a few positive ones that increase prestige or army tradition. When it comes to temporary modifiers, they have quite a few good ones. We have this recruits flock to the standard, which decreases infantry maintenance cost by 25% and increases your reinforcement speed by 30% for 10 years. But then you have the opposite of that event, people refuse conscription, which increases the cost of army maintenance by 25% and decreases reinforcement speed by 30%. But you can always just spend 12 stability to avoid that if you really wanted to. Then for some good events, we have Go for the Eyes, an event you may remember from EU4, which increases your army morale by a flat 10% for 10 years, which is definitely nice. Then you have Send in the Infantry, which increases your infantry's power by 5 for 10 years, and Send in the Cavalry, which does the same for the cavalry, increase it by 5 for 5 years, for 10 years even. Then you have this rather negative event, Fortifications Neglected. This will give a bunch of the forts in your land minus 50 fort defense for 10 years, or you can pay 5 army tradition not to do that. And since quantity and since offense already decreases your fort defense up to 50% if it's maxed, this can make it so your forts fall really, really easily by having minus nearly 100 fort defense. But if you're playing as a nation who's got some bonuses that increase fort defense, or if you have very high literacy soldiers, you can kind of counteract this little. But even so, definitely something to be aware of, because your forts could just fall like as if they were made of paper if you let your fort defense fall too low. When it comes to events for defensive, they have some negative ones that decrease prestige and stability, but they actually have quite a lot of good temporary modifiers. There's literally a lot of them. There are some pretty terrible ones, though. I'll point out this one, Military Complacency, which gives military complacency, which is minus 20% morale for 10 years. Absolutely horrible. Luckily, you can just spend 7 stability and avoid that, but still. On the positive sides, we have, as I mentioned, quite a lot. This Regimental Pride, which reduces army maintenance by 10 for 10 years. Prepared Defense, which increases enemy attrition by 0.5 for 10 years. Regimental Spirit, which reduces food consumption by 20% for 10 years. Relentless Drill, which increases the experience your soldiers gain by 20%, 5% for 10 years. Military Improvements, which give you 5 army tradition and then a +5 morale for 10 years. Fortification Expert, which just builds a castle or fort somewhere in your country seemingly randomly, which could be good if it builds it in a useful location, or could be useless depending on what happens. They have Fortification Expert. This kind of does the opposite of that negative event for Offensive, where this one increases the fort defense of a bunch of your forts, but only by a paltry 10 as opposed to the massive -50 that they lose in the offense branch. And then you have To the Last Man, which gives To the Last Man military tactics +0.10 for 10 years, which basically means your army would survive longer and be able to withstand more damage. Pretty nice events overall for defensive. When it comes to reforms, it's an easy win for offensive because defensive doesn't have any. The two that offensive does have are Horse Artillery, which increases your siege ability by 10%. Keep in mind, this can only be activated in the Age of Absolutionism. The other one is Modern Army Tactics, which increases your reinforcement speed by 5% and gives you assault ability +20%. Assaulting is when you choose to just throw your army at a fort to take it, which can be a rather mixed bag, but I find is much stronger later on in the game than it is early game. Early game, you usually just eviscerate your army throwing it at the fort, whereas late game, it's quite easy to just take forts instantly by assaulting them. This reform is only available after the Age of Revolution starts, so a very late game reform, but could really help in sieging, just assaulting down those late game forts, especially if you can stack the assault ability further through other things. So my overall thoughts, I think I do prefer offensive, but I think offensive might be a bit of a poison chalice if you go too far into it without taking into account how weak your forts are going to be. It reminds me of a situation where you'll lose one battle, you'll be forced to retreat, and the enemy will pursue you and just siege down your forts really fast. Also in situations where you don't have your army fully covering your nation and an enemy slips behind you and starts sieging down your forts, they're going to take your forts very fast at the highest level of offense, which makes me a little cautious about it. Defense is on the other hand, its only real negative is that your army speed is lower. I mean, that's really its only negative, and it's not much of a negative compared to having your forts just be taken from you very quickly. Funnily enough, when it comes to actual fighting, offense doesn't really give you any benefits. Its main benefits is how fast your army is and the fact that you can siege and assault faster. But defensive actually gives a buff to your soldiers in the form of this combat speed buff, which affects how quickly they can get to the front lines from the reserves. Honestly, I'd be rather cautious about offensive. Part of me wants to say that it's worth going for. I mean, it has good reforms, it has good events, but you need to really be aware of that, how weak your forts are going to be at the highest level of offense, and probably need to do things to counteract this negative for your fort defense. Otherwise, your country's going to kind of be a paper tiger where they can just siege it down very quickly. But either way, I think we'll leave it here for today. We've done these 4. Next time we'll probably do capital economics, traditional economics, individualism, communalism, outward, inward, and of course land versus navy. For now though, let me know what you think. Was there a reform or an event or one of these values that really jumped out at you and makes you want to build your whole nation around it? If so, let me know. I'd love to hear what you think and whether you spotted something I didn't, whether you've noted something I didn't. But for now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.